Welcome to TASA Thursdays. My name is Roger Wilkinson. I'm the Digital Publications Editor for TASA, and I would like to thank Emma and Lizzie for presenting today. First of all, I would like to I acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise the continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And today I'm speaking to you from the Gindji country in far north Queensland. So Lizzie Knight is from Victoria University and Emma Colvin is from Sturt University, and today they'll be speaking on assumed parenting roles and systemic gaps in education and justice system. So welcome to you both.
Thanks, Roger, and thank you everyone for coming along. And I'd like to start by also acknowledging country as well. I'm located on Wiradjuri land, Lizzie's located on Wurundjeri land, and the work that we're presenting on today took place mainly on those lands. So I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge that we're on land that's where sovereignty has never been ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend a welcome to all of you here and to any, in particular, any First Nations people present today. On that note, thank you very much again for attending. What we're going to talk about today is a project we started about 2 years ago. We actually completed the funded part of the project earlier this year, and now we're developing it into an academic book. And so I suppose what we want to do in this presentation is talk about the project itself and the findings that came from that project, and how we're, I guess, going deeper into those findings and looking at where we can get some create some new academic knowledge from the findings of that project. So the project itself was the support for care experienced people into higher education, and we were very fortunate to be funded by the Collier Charitable Fund to undertake this research. As part of the research, Lizzie and I also formed an advisory board and partnerships with organisations, including CICA, the Career Industry Council of Australia, and the Create Foundation, which provides advocacy and support for people with experience of the out-of-home care system. So our project essentially was based on this premise. I guess it links my area of research is more, I'm a criminologist, and I look into more about the impacts of care experience on children in the criminal justice system, how they get caught up in the criminal justice system, outcomes of that. And Lizzie's research as well in terms of equity and access to higher education. We kind of brought this together, and I suppose what's come out of this is more of a bringing these two sort of disciplines together is, I guess, a sociology of education, and access to education is where we're going. And what we knew is that existing research shows that parents have been shown to be a strong influence on career decision-making and successful transitions. And looking specifically, we're looking at transitions from high school into higher education, so the school leaver cohort. So of course, that brings into question what happens when you don't have a parent advocating for you, or a parent who's not active in that space. So we were looking specifically at care experienced people have less access to the, parental support, and I suppose also that brought up questions about who are we talking about when we talk about parents, because obviously carers is also really important, and who those carers may be. Are they foster carers? Are they paid carers for organisations? And essentially also overarching that, the way the state is also a parent to children when there is an absence of a family parent, so to speak. And what we do know is that care experience has been shown to be an indicator of less likelihood to progress into education, training or employment. So again, we looked at whether it might be divergent outcomes for people with care experience and where there may be poorer outcomes in some areas. So just moving on to the next slide. So we looked specifically at out-of-home care, and out-of-home care is essentially it's when children for one reason or another are removed from the family home, and they may be placed into foster care, kinship care, which is with other family members, or in some form of group home or residential facility that's run by an organisation or by the government, depending on whereabouts you are. And sometimes children can be removed permanently from the home and can go under the care of the minister, where the minister takes parental responsibility. Sometimes it may be just for a short period of respite care, or sometimes children are going in and out of cycles of being within care and out of care as well. So it's not necessarily a linear experience for children, and often children can cycle into different types of care as well. So they might spend time with a family member, they might spend time in foster care, and these might change. And sometimes children can have stable placements that last until adulthood and even beyond adulthood in an informal sense. And in some jurisdictions, care arrangements can go beyond the age of 18. And sometimes they can be quite unstable placements, and children can experience insecurity in placement and transitions to many different placements over the course of their childhood. So children in out-of-home care represent about 1 to 2% of the child population at any one point in time. And as I said before on the previous slide, research has shown that there can be poorer life outcomes for children if they've experienced time in out-of-home care. And this can be in the spheres of education, health, and criminal justice as well. So in terms of the existing literature looking specifically at transitions into the higher education space, there is some research that exists in this area, and some of you may be familiar in particular with work coming out of Sturt University, but not a lot specifically looking at care experience and the transition to higher education and about the needs of students as well, but also about the going the other way in terms of the way higher education institutions understand the needs of care experienced people, how they interact and rely on the role of the parent in terms of admissions and looking at transitioning into higher education. We also know that there's no national collection of data in relation to care experience in Australia. However, we do know that internationally we've seen jurisdictions recognise the importance of collecting this sort of data. So for example, in the UK, in the last few years, there is much more comprehensive collection of data on care experience and a recognition of care experience as an indicator of disadvantage. And so that is actually now officially recorded. So what we know is that the Bradley report in Australia that recognises factors of disadvantage does not recognise care experience in that sense. However, we've seen in the UK, we've seen some trends towards recognition of that. So I suppose we're also looking at how perhaps we can look to finding more information out to inform, given the lack of data as well. So these were the research questions we came up for the project. Firstly, are public educational institutions recognising the challenges of care experienced people? So that's looking at the institutional view of young people transitioning and the supports that they have around them. And then we looked at how different parts of the sector supporting care experienced people in the transition to higher education. So then we looked also about what supports are in place in terms of not just admissions, but also upon starting, things like residential facilities, that kind of thing, mentoring, support, and whether there were any specific for care experienced people. And just moving on to the next slide, I think here is when I'm handing over to Lizzie.
Yeah. Thanks, Emma, and thanks everyone. And I'd just like to say that I'm coming to you from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge elders past and present, and how much this subject has effect onto populations who are Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander heritage. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the method of what we did last year, and then start to introduce what we're going to do next year. So it feels a little bit like I'm the pivot point, hopefully, of this presentation. So we took a layered technique, and we were very cognizant that we don't want to position care experienced people either as heroes or as extremely, tragic cases. That we just wanted to think about what are the institutional barriers. We took an institutional lens, and we were kind of a bit matter of fact about that, in terms of that we know that technically from a government systemic position there isn't particular support for care experienced people, and we wanted to know how does that affect them them systemically, and how do institutions, do they even know? We decided we weren't going to do individual interviews. I've got some views particularly about when you necessitate talking to individuals. We wanted to look at the structural barriers, and that at this point didn't need it. So we did a layered technique of trying to understand the field, basically. We looked at how people transition in and transition through and to institutions. So you might have a long process in terms of ideating, thinking about where you're going to go, making choices that do involve travel, accommodation, all those kind of questions, which are often more real for people who have experience out of home care, because perhaps even if they're back in their home of origin, it might not be somewhere that they're able to stay for university studies. We looked at public data collection, which was none, basically, although we note that New South Wales in their admissions service are now collecting public data. So for future work, that will be really interesting. And we worked with Create and had some researchers with lived experience do a website analysis for us of trying to find the information, not just us doing it, but they really looked as if they were looking themselves. And that was a really rich part of the project, and helped us sort of understand what were the unknown unknowns of what we didn't expect to look for. And we also did a survey with career counsellors to talk about what did they know. Now, we've got other materials about this. This is run through, and so we ended up with these kind of data collection. We did semi-structured interviews with equity and diversity staff, and it's really interesting. In the last 10 years, the growth of funding for higher education participation plans, which may be waning now, has led to some pockets, including La Trobe, having some really good practices and institutional practice. And actually, Emma and I were really surprised at the difference between the institutions who were performing amazingly well and had really wraparound services from start to through to services where there was nothing about for people with care experience, or any of the issues, if you need to have funding for accommodation, all those kind of things. So that was how we undertook the data collection, and we talked to marketing staff at Australian universities who were fascinating. And part of my other research is about distinguishing between different institutions and the marketisation of higher education, and that now different equity groups have become a marketing force, was a fascinating thing that we're writing a little bit about at the moment and under heavy review. So we're not going to talk too much about this, but our key 3 findings, which we've published on our website, we'll give you the project website, and we'll give you, I'm sorry, the dog's very noisy, I'm not sure if you can hear that. But the first finding was there's a systemic lack of understanding of the needs of care experienced students in institutions of higher education, significant gap in post-transition planning for young people with care experience. It sort of falls between 2 stools, really, of into adulthood on all the forms. The most basic thing was on all the forms, they don't write about your future plans necessarily. It's just what you'll be doing next, and there's no sort of literal space in the planning, and it's a very resource tight service to talk about what your hopes and future kind of ideations are. And there are multiple significant structural barriers for accessing appropriate career information and information that you need to progress your career for care experienced young people. I mean, we can say also that these are most often not located in the individual. They're mainly systemic, and they're often financial or related to financial constraints. And I think that this is really the whole project sort of things we need to look at the institution and think about that. So our projects, and this will be recorded, and this is our project findings and infographic are on skep.edu.au, and we had really good dissemination this year. We've talked to some service providers, trained some people about career information who support young people with care experience, and done some webinars for career practitioners as well. So we've done all that, and we felt that the impact of that was good. There's more to do, but we also felt that there was more thinking to do, that we sort of felt that this was a really base from. And so this is where we sort of started. That what it really questioned and poked and problematized is this idea of parenting and the obligations of the state in both formal ways, as Emma said, about when the state acts as the parent, and also about what the state expects the parent to do, particularly in education and in career development and in accommodation for universities and all kinds of things like that. And we're sort of trying to understand how care experienced young people can help understand their experience and understand what the structures. I've been reading some Carol Backey, and she says, what's your proposal? And the proposal here is that parenting is a sort of a not very critiqued idea. It needs to be critiqued more. So the overview of this book, which Emma and I were just talking before, and I personally got nervous. It's due in 9 days, less than a year. It's due on the 30th of November. So we've got a bit of time, but that'll go quickly. So its idea is we're talking about care experience people's trajectories. We're taking, and it is not, well, we don't mean it in a diminishing way, taking the divergent case to better understand the whole. So we're hoping to understand about how parenting works by thinking about people who have less access to an idealized form of parenting. And it isn't everybody's experience, it's an idealized form of parenting. And we're thinking about systemic changes to that. So the first sort of overview of what we're talking about is, I'm sorry, I just closed the door, some parenting going on, or my lack of parenting going on there, is care experienced young people we know experience disadvantage across multiple domains of life, including post-school education. And there are major studies that explored the long-term outcomes, but they don't adequately address sort of the barriers, the systemic barriers to entry of higher education, often have a more individualized focus. And so we're trying to look at how parenting is understood by and what that proposes as a barrier. And we think that there is a sort of conceit that higher education, post-school education sort of provides the best possible chance of breaking the poverty cycle, as outcomes and data really show that, without saying that if you don't go to higher education, that's what happens. But I think it's important that that higher education is a tool of social mobility, and that's the way in which we understand it. We also know that prior education, this is Emma sort of more across this than me, that shows that education positively impacts sentencing of young people before the courts. So you've got a double disadvantage, if you don't have education plans and the rest. So I'm just going to say this is sort of the theoretical lens. We're actually using a different lens, but in terms of thinking about the case, we like the bachelor's ball, this Pébaudieu's Le Bal de Célibataires, being very French, is that it was the idea that you can think about, understand a society better by looking at who's excluded. And we feel that strongly that a lot of the narratives about including parents in career advice discussions, including parents as normal in higher education, universities, sort of open days and things like that. Who's excluded and how does it mean the field is mainly being played? And we're sort of taking that kind of understanding from Bourdieu, where he talks about in agrarian societies, the second and third and fourth sons of landowners weren't allowed to marry because otherwise the farms would get too small. And he said, well, what does that tell us about this agrarian society in the deep south of France? So we focus on contracted parent support from the state as a case that enables the examination how a lack of an idealized parent can disadvantage a school leaver as they explore and take action on their career goals. And I think I'm finishing on this slide. And so we're taking this as systemic challenges. I like this big old library for the really old traditional barrier-driven elite entry to higher education. But we intentionally explore these systemic barriers as a challenge using unobtrusive research, which focused on the supporters of care experienced young people. And we think that there's benefits of taking this holistic viewpoint, particularly when there's a strong relationship between parental ability to engage with career pathways and young people's career tensions and future aspirations. I'm going to pass on to Emma. Give me a nod, that's right.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do now is, I suppose, we're going to sort of talk you through how we're trying to conceptualize how this book will make the points we're trying to make. And what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is just to sort of take a step back a bit and provide a bit more background context to how we're going to, I guess, go about doing that. So just to move on to the next slide. Right. So I guess what we want to really do is, as Lizzie said, so set out the problem statement, I guess, which is about how parenting is conceptualized. Now, what's critical here is we're not talking about parents, we're talking about this idea of parenting. And I suppose, you know, the term that's used sometimes in the literature is about whether or not you have a competent parent. Now, what we mean by competent means different things in different spaces. And I suppose what we're looking at here is a parent who is engaged in their child's future and aspirations and is kind of with them along the way on that. So it could be in terms of anywhere sort of from a parent who's present throughout a child's life and talks about things like, what do you want to do when you grow up? You can do that. How about we do, you know, and even just being involved in schooling, which is, as we know, in terms of primary and secondary education, having a parent who's very involved in a child's education is an indicator of success. And then even just things like having someone to drive you to an open day, or even telling you that it's on, someone to help you fill out an application form. So there's different sort of levels even within that. And I suppose at the start of the book, we're going to be looking at, first of all, through the lens of the education system and also through the lens of criminal justice and child protection system. So just on the next slide, Lizzie, if you want to just switch over. So in this part, we're looking at the structure of the education system and transitions from secondary to tertiary education. And we're examining the roles of key players in career transitions and advancement, including teachers and schools, career counselling, university and other tertiary sector marketing personnel. We're also hoping to unpack the equity and diversity issues and supports available to students from disadvantaged and marginalised backgrounds. So again, looking more broadly at Bradley indicators, not specifically, so we'll be narrowing down to care experience. And we're going to be drawing on Rose's work as he interprets Foucault's broader concept of governmentality and how parenting in contemporary society can be understood as a technology through a governmentality lens. We're talking about the responsibilization of the role of parents in helping children transition to tertiary education. And we're going to critique that and provide an analytical framework through which our data is analysed in the discussion chapters. And essentially, we'll also be doing that from the perspective of justice and welfare systems as well. So just on the next slide, Lizzie, thanks. So this is where we're going to look at the complex interactions between children with histories of abuse and trauma and poor life outcomes and interactions with the criminal justice system. So we're going to look particularly at the overrepresentation of the criminal justice system of children with care experience. And again, breaking down what that actually means in terms of children who offend, children who are caught up in offending, noting that most children do not offend, and most children who do offend do not continue to offend into adulthood. But then we sort of unpack that a bit more in terms of more specific experiences within certain populations as well. We'll also unpack here, it's something we haven't talked about a lot to date in this seminar, but the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in the criminal justice system. And you've got this kind of, then you've got overrepresentation of the criminal justice system, overrepresentation in out-of-home care system as well. And then these are all brought together in this sort of really complicated system of overrepresentation. So we're going to also look at sort of these interactions between these different systems and how children can cycle between the criminal justice system and the welfare child protection system as well, and how responsibility for this cohort of children is often shared between agencies when parents aren't present or parents aren't necessarily the primary caregivers in their lives at that time. And the roles of, say, youth justice, child welfare agencies and ancillary support providers. And we're going to unpack the role of the carer and parental responsibility here. We're also going to look at the intersection of trauma and homelessness and out-of-home care, and how all these experiences exacerbate contact with the criminal justice system, but also setting out, again, how that affects future prospects for children as well. So Lizzie mentioned before, education can have a positive impact in terms of what we call desistance from crime. So children who may be offending, having education and employment are key factors in desistance from crime. And also in terms of some research I've done, some earlier research I've done, bail decisions and sentencing decisions can be impacted by things such as having family support, having access to education, having access to employment. So for example, if a child is seeking bail, potentially there are occasions where having a family member being able to say, I'm going to make sure that they meet curfew, I'm going to make sure I drive them to school every day, can be a big factor in alleviating some of the risks of granting someone bail. Or perhaps in terms of sentencing decisions, it gives a magistrate more options at sentencing if a young person before the court is enrolled in a TAFE course, for example, or has some kind of something that can then be linked to a sentencing outcome in terms of showing that they're going to perform well outside a more severe or perhaps custodial sentence. And again, that can also be things like a parent saying they can work part-time with me or something like that. And then these are other factors that can sort of give a magistrate some pause to consider more broader sentencing options when there are options in place, whereas children and young people who don't have those options, the options for sentencing and bail are also somewhat restricted there. So I guess there's more context provided there in terms of why we're then looking at why being able to transition is more important, but also why we've seen some children with care experience are less likely to be transitioning into higher education. This unpacks some of the reasons why and some of the more complicating factors behind that as well. And so if we just move on to the next slide, these are some of the analytical themes that we're going to be exploring in that second half of the book now that we kind of set that background up. I'm just going to run through them quickly, and I think Lizzie's going to unpack those further. So firstly, we're going to be looking at identifying the role of a parent and expectations of parenting, gaps in parental expectations, parental support into adulthood, and crisis parenting by the state. And I'm going to hand you back to Lizzie now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Emma. I'll go through these all 5 themes which sort of have arisen from our data collection from the project, but sort of go beyond them and hopefully move beyond them. So this first one, which is a very idealized image, but we just thought it was interesting that we do think that the idea of a parent is sort of idealized and identified in sort of certain kind of really specific gendered ways. And I think it's both gendered and cisgendered in a way, talking about women and cis women's sort of life journeys. We acknowledge that, and we acknowledge the role and that how this may become even more complicated in terms of LGBTQI lives. And so this chapter is going to examine, or this sort of theme is going to examine how the role of the parents defined, not through explicit rules or guidelines, but through their responses to the perceived failures of unwritten rules, which are produced and reproduced in social discourse, because Carol Vincent kind of says. There's no parenting license that ever is given, at least in Australia and nowhere to my knowledge, that clearly defines what a parental role is. And if it were, it would be extremely gendered and particular by sexuality, kind of different assumptions. And so we worked with the desktop analysis that provided us insights into how the idea of a parent is constructed by formal government, legalistically, and also by institutional processes, thinking back to higher education as a case in point. We thought about that there's some clear, widely understood, socially mainly accepted aspects of the role of a parent, feeding, clothing, and that are clear boundaries. But some aspects are less clear and becoming even less clear. More broadly, failure is extremely devastating to the individuals involved and also to different trajectories. And when a perceived failure has occurred, when parents are supposed to implicitly know what was expected of them, and we're not talking necessarily in the most extreme cases, but we're talking softer and in terms of different ideas of how career aspirations are now supposed to form in the home. And so we particularly engage with literature that maps the growing scope of the idealized role in parenting and the implications for education and justice systems. And I just want to say that a lot of this is also within the role of parenting children with disabilities. And there's some particularly interesting literature that's come out while we've been writing this up about what a parent of a disabled child is supposed to do, and also conversely, and I speak as a disabled parent, what a disabled parent can do and what you can't do. And so I think there's some really intersectional, interesting stuff about gender, and I'm sure race, and also ability and disability. So we're mapping here in this next chapter. This is we found a parenting book that they had. Is there a book on parenting? Well, there isn't, but there are increasingly codified ways in which we talk about the role of parents. There are and about the expectations of parents. And we talk about outreach practitioners, and thinking now, on this case of transition to higher education, we look at, how new models of interactions, what's expected about you take your child to open day, you help them understand, you fill in the admissions form. If you don't know all the different options, you are really an active participant in that higher education process. And a very middle class habitus is being kind of drawn across, that everyone is supposed to sort of adhere to. And so where specific examples of success are linked to taking people other than a parent a hero's role in a child's life, using very charity discourse, someone stepped in and then they were able to save this child and bring them forward. It does sometimes result in better outcomes, but that's a very individualized happenstance and ad hoc precarious experience where it should be a systemic kind of thing. You shouldn't have to be lucky to have the same equitable chances as everybody else. And it further examines how some of the additional complexities have been added to the parenting role by technology, new expectations of digital literacy to a high level of competency, and how these interact with transitions. And the chapter sort of identifies where these interactions can be problematic for state-supported contract parenting, and what gaps that this might lead if you don't have an advocating, active, extremely middle class kind of idealized parental agent working with and for you as a young adult. So we examine a little bit in this chapter, and we tease out what happens when parents don't meet these lofty and, extremely high expectations that also formulate the idea of a family, of maybe having two children. And so they deal with quite specific ideas of what parenting is. If somebody had 6 or 7 children, they perhaps wouldn't be able to do the same thing, but they are also excluded and marginalized from discourses about how parenting relate. So in this chapter, we draw on data from the care sector professionals who we asked to speak not only about their experience about the care sector, but what they thought the perceived thing that parents should do in terms of in this space. And we thought that the gap between contracted parents and other parents furthers the gaps between suggested contract parenting practices and what is frequently able to happen because of resource needs. And we're thinking now particularly in terms of out of care home settings and foster parents, perhaps with multiple transitions during a period if you haven't had a long care setting. And we sort of problematize the notion that the failure is only located in the care system, and highlight that their previous practices in education justice system would have provided extra services that are now assumed to be undertaken in the home, and examining what this failure of a care experience young people's career trajectories, where does the blame lie? And we're sure that the blame doesn't lie in the individual care experience student, and we don't think it lies in the care support system. We think that this is the movement of blame between different systems, which you can see in other areas as well. We then now in this sort of parental support into adulthood, we're digging into the idea of examining class and parental capability in invocations of class when we talk about what we expect parents to do. And we use data that recounts problems young people can experience whilst in post-school education, barriers, gaps, difficulties they might experience. The chapter, it's including accommodation, including sort of funding for books, things like this that aren't stepped in by the state. We're going to seek to understand the different settlements of parental support for young people, particularly with an attenuation of youth where adulthood isn't necessary till much into early 20s at the earliest. The capability of families from perhaps, less means or lower socioeconomic backgrounds, which is, in itself a problematic term, can in some senses be more limited from those from high, medium socioeconomic backgrounds, although that can also be a problem for them if they have multiple children or other demands or other care needs. And so we're going further than broad monolithic parents, and we don't particularly seek to take a socioeconomic lens to this, and nor do we seek to take a class analysis, although we believe class is important and riven through these debates. But we want to particularly provide sort of interrogation of what the proposals, what these ideas are that seem to be in the system, that accommodation is fine all through university, that you can live on the Centrelink Oz study or AB study support, which is ridiculous, to be honest, and these kind of proposals that you don't have to have other work, that you don't have to work full-time while you're studying and things like that. It's particularly important and decreasingly fantastically the case because in Australia suddenly more and more jurisdictions, even over the course of this project, have extended the period of care from 18 to 21, and that's a wonderful, and people like Create who worked with us have done so much about this and have really made a huge difference. And just that one switch of extending by 3 years, which probably is quite expensive but is not a complex change, has made such a lot of difference to the higher education transition plans of young people. I'm going to hand over to Emma to talk about crisis parenting by the state.
All right, thanks, Lizzie. And so this is our last sort of substantive analysis chapter of the book and explores that last key theme, which is crisis parenting by the state, and essentially aims to provide further explanation about these divergent experiences. For this part of the analysis, we look at how pressure situations highlight crisis issues, and essentially that state intervention is reduced to crisis intervention post hoc rather than planning and embedding support and strategies to prevent a crisis. So this chapter is very much informed also by the care sector professionals that we spoke to. And they talk about issues in terms of the length of placements for care experienced young people, and also in terms of carers and other parents having enough time to understand career and other life decisions and to work through these with young people. So again, when we're looking at children transitioning through different placements, so they're building up new relationships with new carers, and how much of that might be just about settling into a new place, also challenges with feeling comfortable in a place when they might change again later. So again, we do see children cycling in and out of different forms of care. So stability is a big issue there, but also stability in parenting as well. Sometimes we've seen when children, this is not just in our research, but other research as well, that when children and young people get to what we call a crisis point in their lives in terms of perhaps very severe charges before the criminal courts, that there's lots of interventions at that stage and lots of agencies working with children, but it seems to be always, as we know, crisis intervention post hoc and not necessarily pre-planning. And again, there was very much a discussion, a thick, really key discussion that came out from our interviews, was that participants were raising this idea of survival parenting or crisis parenting as opposed to aspirational parenting. So this is real difference there as well in terms of the, as Lizzie mentioned before, parenting is more than just the very basic things we understand in terms of shelter, clothing, food. But again, it's about having conversations about what do you want to do? How can we make that happen? Is that possible? Yes, it's possible. And again, we did see that where it worked for children and young people people was often where there was, what we call the career hero in their lives. So the person that came in and was like the mentor to them and inspired them and helped them to go through. But again, that's not a systemic change, and that's can sometimes be just about luck of the draw. So again, where parenting is happening through the state or actors for the state, we're tending to see it just being about survival or crisis parenting. So we're going to really unpack that in that last analysis chapter. And that moves us on to our conclusions, which I think, we're still evolving at this stage. And I suppose what we're looking at here is two sort of key things that we want to unpack as part of our conclusions, which is this idea of idealized capabilities. And I suppose what we're looking at here is...
do you want me to do that?
Yes, if you would, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's actually fine. Sorry, so this idealized capabilities, the idea is active support of idealized parenting behaviors. Increasingly, we think has been naturalized as part of the educational system. And there's been consequences for many young people, not just those, in out-of-home care, but also in permanent homes whose parents are either, newly arrived, don't have time for whatever reason, including, very rich people with all the resources they can have, but not always people have time for this. And so the impact of the increased need for parental engagement in post-school career development processes is the subject of this book and a key pivot point. And I think that there's a real issue in parenting discourses, particularly as I'm a careers counsellor, and as a careers counsellor, increasingly we're expecting a lot has been taken from the resource of the careers counsellors and given to parents. And one reason for that is a wonderful reason that there's a massification of systems, is that there's huge numbers of more of the age cohort going to university needing that advice about what tertiary options is. It isn't just people leaving school earlier, so that's wonderful, but the point is the resource for those directing them hasn't increased. So what has happened is that parents have been inculcated into a part of the support for post-school career development has gone back into the home. And that's where we bring back this term of governmentality, think about how the government has sort of encroached into ideas of removing something that used to be provided by the state and now requiring it of parents as a quasi kind of requirement of being a parent. And the result of this contract parent experience in this context, it relies on competent parents with very specific, very particular, defined in a particular way, idealized capabilities, an imperative technology, a technology of the state, we're saying, for child success. And it gives you divergent experience of success for not only care experienced young people who may succeed very well and in very trajectories that are very standard, but generally see on average poorer life outcomes and less chance of accessing particular forms of particularly high status higher education. And then the systemic finding changes you want me to do, or do you want me to do it, Emma? You're right, shall I go ahead?
Yeah, if you want to continue, or I can.
No, you go for it.
Okay. I suppose, more broadly, what we're actually looking at here again is not looking at any changes that are focused on individuals per se, but recognizing the systemic issues and making systemic changes. And these, they often can be quite idealistic, lofty sort of goals, but I think it's also, there may be some ways that we can identify in this book that to start steps towards a systemic change. So I think some of the key things that we'll be looking at, recommending in terms of how to make that systemic change would be the recognition of care experience as a factor of disadvantage, the collection of data, but also about how we change the rhetoric around it. So again, very much we're looking at deficit models here as well, because we're looking at the way the system results in a deficit, but we individualize that deficit onto the person who takes on that deficit. And then there's often a stigma, for example, around care, so people don't necessarily always identify or may not feel comfortable. And then there's also the silence on the other side, the systemic side, in terms of support specifically for care experienced people. And so I think there's this cycle of also a stigma that also needs to be overcome as well. So there are things being done around the country that we saw some of our practitioners talked about in terms of more positive awareness of care experience, and just the normalization of it as well, in a sense, rather than a stigmatization or a constant association with deficit. So I think that's really what we're looking at there in terms of systemic changes as well. And I suppose what we ultimately want to be doing is providing, I guess, recommendations for policy change within Australian education and child protection systems in an effort to improve that access. So we're hoping also that this will provide a basis for global comparison and recommendations for other jurisdictions. And yeah, that's moving on to suggestions for practice now as well, which is part of that, how systemic change can happen. Here's some suggestions, some practical suggestions for you.
And I can talk a little bit to them in terms of that we think that there is things that can be done for individuals, the provision of career development resources, and doesn't mean just leaflets, but actually provision of resources in the budgets for care experienced practitioners, either foster carers or kinship carers or any kind of care, that there is time and space in some way to build career development and future thinking in, because I think that's what we found over and over again, is people were thinking we don't have time for the career development because it's not a requirement, and we're often in multiple and and interlinking crises points, and it just not having time and not being something they have to do. So that's a really important point. And we think that their state has a responsibility to identify and to engage with the ideas of career planning as part of transitioning out of care. And it's not just about getting in work and getting, not that there's anything wrong with getting a job and a retail job and a hospo job or things like that, but important to understand how that's part of a long-term trajectory, and you can build it. And also we know that it's not necessarily important to go to university at 18. I didn't go and succeed at 18, but to have a plan of a long-term, a 5-year, 10-year, and how to seek help over the period. We also think that there's a real important back to the professional associations, who are also our partners in this, about in making sure that you've got trauma-informed career practitioners who aren't, who are both mindful and not triggered themselves, but also able to help in a kind of really practical way of career planning. They're not asking for them all to be counsellors, but to be trauma-informed and work in ways that aren't unsafe for the young people. And also for there to be a needs-based approach, and that's a sort of motherhood statement a little bit, but also for things to be available and to be able to pull down kind of things, and things like the National School Leaver Information Service, which has a particular provision for care experienced young people, is fantastic. So our next slide, and really final slide, is because we know TASA, many people in TASA are in the academy in one way or another, in universities, and you can do something yourself about your institution. Ask your institution, just send an email to the admissions requirement desk, what materials are available to support care experienced young people. Ask if there are links to creating your care career pages that can give information about how to find out about getting a job. People can read about trauma-informed decision-making, because all tutors should really know about how that would inform students that they may be interacting with, who shouldn't have to declare that they have care experience. I think you have to assume that people do have different backgrounds and have different, pathways to study. And also, if you can find out from local universities, probably they're really on the edge of possibility, but do share a report, infographics widely, and do keep in touch with us.